Okay, so here we are with the last video of the week, the second lecture, of course, that I'm recording directly, but the last video. And I say that because I hope you're watching these in the chronological order in which they're posted on Canvas, and that ideally you are watching this after you've participated in the Homelessness in Niceville roleplay. It's not essential if you're watching this before you play the exercise. It's not the end of the world. It's just that the exercise gives some nice context to what we're talking about and what we're doing, as of course do the other lectures, or rather other videos I've asked you to watch, those from Larry Suskind and so on and so forth. I hope the exercise and those videos have given you by now a good sense of what consensus building is, and I just want to use this video as a chance to kind of recap some of the key concepts and also maybe introduce a few things that I don't think are covered fully or were covered fully in the other videos. And so by now I hope it's also clear that I'm a fan of the consensus building approach. I certainly have a bias there. I worked at SPIA while I was in grad school for a few years as a consultant, and certainly learned a lot from the pros there, and you know, a fan of the way that this model works. I hope it's clear by now when we would use consensus building approaches when we have this kind of wicked policy or planning challenges where there are multiple issues involved, there are multiple stakeholders that have a stake. That is to say, they either have some influence over the decision or decisions, and or are likely to be impacted by the decisions. And so we need to find ways to bring those different stakeholders, or more specifically, representatives of different stakeholders together to deliberate on those challenges and to seek creative solutions that are going to provide enough of what everybody wants that they can live with it. So we're seeking consensus, meaning we're seeking essentially the point where everybody can get on board with the decision that's going to be made. And I really like the Homelessness in Niceville role play. It's not one I made, as you will have seen. I've made various role plays, some more complicated than this, some, of course, that like we played in class with the art fair, for example, much simpler. But I really like this one. It's from the program of negotiation, where I also had a chance to spend some time. It's, you know, it gets at a lot of the dynamics we want to be thinking about here, right? We have these different stakeholders, we have these different interest groups that have been brought together, and they all have some interdependency, that is to say, some incentive to try to cooperate with each other. There are things they can each gain or lose through different potential outcomes, and therefore that they want to seek an outcome that is, that provides benefits to each of them, that they all can live with. And so, you know, one thing I'd like you to think about, it, assuming you've already played by this point, is what were the outcomes and how did they reflect those interests? How did they address how did you start to enumerate the different interests and concerns of different parties and use that enumeration or that understanding of different parties' interests and priorities to shape a outcome that everybody could live with. And I want to acknowledge, unfortunately, you know, you did not have nearly enough time, or will not, if you haven't played yet, have nearly enough time to play this exercise. Ideally, the exercise takes an hour at least to play, and by the time you get set up in class, it's with this short class periods this year, or this semester, it's only about 50 minutes you have, or sorry, not 50 minutes, only about half an hour you have, and I think that's unfortunate, but I hope you at least get a taste for what this can look like. And of course, in the real world, I mean, it's not even an hour, it's not even 2 hours. It's, you know, these processes can run over days or weeks of, you know, meeting intermittently. And in some ways, that's actually a shame with doing a role play like this, is you don't get a full taste for the iterative way in which this can happen, with parties going back to their constituents and so on and so forth. A much more iterative, long-term series of meetings is typically how these would be approached. Okay, and so as I said, a key question would be, how did you reach agreement? What was the process? What did it look like? How did things unfold? Were there key moments? Were there times when people shifted their positions? And what I mean by shifting in positions is that each of you came in presumably with at least some sense, based on your confidential instructions, of what your group wanted out of the process. And that was very positional, right? You knew you wanted this and not that to happen. But the ideal is that in the process you start to understand not just your position and the positions others are expressing, but the interests that underlie your position and others' positions, so that you can be a little bit more creative in finding ways to meet those interests, those underlying interests, while shifting positions. And again, that's where a lot of the creativity happens. So I'd like you to think about that. What did it look like? What did the agreement look like in the end? Was it a deviation from the initial positions of the groups involved? And if so, why was that acceptable? What made that acceptable? What were the key moments that allowed you to reach that agreement? And of course, as I'm going to talk about more in a moment here, not every group reached agreement or will reach agreement. And so what does that tell us? What are some of the barriers? And I'd be curious. I wish we could have this as a two-way conversation, because those barriers can be variable. There are multiple reasons why we can have, things that can get in the way of reaching agreement, to the point of the question here. Sometimes they have to do with a certain degree of intransigence on the part of parties. And I don't necessarily mean that negatively. It sounds negative to say intransigence, but really what that means is a party is holding on to a position because they genuinely see it as the best way to achieve their interests, and they're not willing to budge, or they're willing to give very little in terms of budging. And it's important to recognize that in some negotiations or some consensus-building processes like this, that some parties are more motivated to try to advance consensus, and others less so, right? To others, for example, if we use the negotiation concepts we discussed last week, because of course they directly connect to this, would be that they have a good BATNA, right? So if a party has a good BATNA, a good best alternative to a negotiated agreement away from the table, they're less incentivized to invest in finding an agreement here. And in fact, they might be invested in being a spoiler to some degree, if we're honest about it, and that there's understandable reasons for that. And so identifying how much different parties are invested in it, how we might ameliorate or address the concerns of parties, how we can help to provide a situation or options for parties that are at least better than their current BATNA for everybody becomes critical, right? Because again, as we talked about last week, we shouldn't expect parties to walk away from a BATNA, from something that's better than what they're getting at the table. And that's where that bottom point, this question of parties benefiting from no agreement. And sometimes we'll play a game when, again, I've mentioned, I think last week, at least to some of you, that I used to teach a whole semester negotiation course before coming to VT. And in that course, we would actually run a game, or I would run a game where there was essentially a party in the negotiation that, frankly, had a better BATNA away from the table. And it was always interesting to see if the party realized that. And of course, it comes down to some degree, if we're honest about it, personality. Some people feel like, oh, I'm here, I'm part of this, everybody else is coming to agreement, I just really need to come to agreement. Or realizing, oh, actually, I don't really need an agreement, I am better off without this agreement. How can I, if anything, be a spoiler and try to help other party or encourage other parties away from an agreement? So anyway, some tactical things to think about there. And of course, communications breakdowns. And in the short time you had to play, you didn't have a lot of chance to get into the kind of nitty-gritty of communicating with each other. But going back to the concepts from negotiation last week, being a good active listener, being a good detective, are just such valuable skills here, right? Because that's how you start to dig below the surface into those interests and start to understand what parties really care about, and then can be creative after that in trying to find solutions that meet those interests, while also, of course, meeting yours. So sadly, we don't have the time in class at all. We don't have enough time to even play the game, let alone debrief it. So what I'm asking you to do really is think on your own about these questions. And I'm going to walk through them here and, as necessary, perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what we mean by each. But again, I would genuinely encourage you, even if it means pausing the video for a moment, to think about, well, what was your experience, and how might you answer this question if I was cold calling you in class? So first would be, how did or can you focus on interests rather than positions in negotiations? And again, I think I've covered this around being a good detective, good active listening, asking good why questions to help parties get below the surface. Did you form coalitions? How did they help or hurt the progress? How about caucusing? In the short time you had, I'm not sure that we saw very many, that we'll see, I should say, very many coalitional dynamics. Sometimes the governor's office and the neighborhood association will start to form a little bit of a loose coalition. And coalitions can be useful both as what we can call winning coalitions or blocking coalitions. And so a winning coalition, as the name implies, is a coalition that starts to build a package that they want to advance as a solution to the problem. And what they're ultimately trying to do is bring more and more parties into that coalition until they have that critical mass for it to be successful. A blocking coalition, as the name implies, is the opposite. As I mentioned on the last slide, there's sometimes parties who maybe don't want an agreement, and therefore they may be invested in trying to build a coalition of people who are going to oppose whatever's being proposed. And that's okay too, right? But thinking about the way coalitional dynamics work. Certainly in terms of caucusing, there are times when parties that find themselves in alliance and coalition may want to caucus, quote unquote, away from the table, may want to strategize, discuss see how they can meet each other's interests and negotiate essentially among themselves first, for example, if they're trying to build a winning coalition as a package. And that's okay, right? I don't think that will happen at all this week, just with a short time. But if you had longer, I can see that starting to emerge. How much time is spent discussing issues and probing interests? Well, that's a good question, and I, of course, can watch you all to some degree, but I don't get a full sense of that across the various groups playing. But I encourage you to think about it, right? Were you efficient in your probing of interests, of asking people, again, as I said before, the why questions, of asking people as you move along a little bit towards solutions, asking people to, as Larry Susskind says in his video, asking people to productively suggest what they would want or what would help make the deal acceptable if there are holdouts. So really pushing the parties to be contributors to a solution. How was agreement finally reached, if you reached one? How did you overcome deadlocks? What were the risks of not reaching full consensus? So I'm recording this after the Monday group. I should have said that after the Monday group went before Wednesday and Friday here, though. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen with other groups, but I know on Monday, the two of the three groups that did reach more or less an outcome, an agreement, more or less left out one of the parties. And I'm not going to say who, just, in case some of you are watching this before you play later this week, tomorrow, Wednesday, or on Friday. But I would encourage you to think about what were the risks of not everybody being on board if that happened. What can happen as a result of that? And how would you identify the key stakeholder groups in a similar real-world situation? That's a really important question, right? We don't naturally know who all the key stakeholders are. How do we find out who they might be? Okay, and so as I said already, I'm hoping by now you've already watched these videos, the other videos here. And if you haven't, I would even encourage you now, pause this, go watch those, because they really provide the overview of what consensus building approach means. And I think they're reasonably well done videos. They feature Larry Susskind, who is certainly one of the key parents of this approach, and that I had the chance of working with quite extensively. He was my PhD dissertation advisor. And again, I think that you can learn much more from watching those. But I am going to walk through a bit of the essential steps here from the CBI's diagram, just to give you a little bit more of at least an archetypal model of how consensus building processes can be designed and unfold, and then provide a couple of examples and some other key things I'd like to share with you here. But again, please watch these if you haven't yet. And so what are some of the essential steps in the consensus building process? And this is an archetypal model. In the real world, any consensus building-like process is going to be tailored to fit the situation. It's going to reflect the preferences and styles of different professional facilitators, mediators, process designers that are doing this. And it's going to, frankly, reflect things like how much money is available, right? What is the budget for a process? So some of these things, can be more extensive or less extensive. And I should say, ideally, the budget is not sort of the budget follows the complexity and other issues. And so, in other words, sometimes a situation just may be less complex, maybe more straightforward, and therefore the budget's likely to be smaller, and therefore there'll be less time invested in some of these steps. That all said, typically a consensus building process would more or less unfold like this, right? So we want to be thinking first of all about the convening phase. So when we're initiating discussion, when we're preparing an issue assessment, and what does that mean? Well, it means that we're starting to get a sense of what are the various issues at stake. As we talk about complex or wicked policy planning challenges, it's typically not one definition of what the issue is. And so what are the issues from different stakeholders' perspectives? How do they intertwine with other issues? How do we understand who the appropriate stakeholders are and who could represent them? How do we get the commitment of parties to engage in the process? How do we decide whether or not there's enough to go ahead? In other words, is there enough commitment on the part of parties? Does it seem clear that we could resolve this? And last but not least, we want to make sure that there's buy-in from the authorities, from the ultimate decision makers, to support a process like this. And we are going to come back to this a little later in the semester, but we often put this under this kind of broad umbrella of what we call assessment. And I've been doing some work, coincidentally, from a research perspective on the state of assessment and how assessment is done. But we often do this as what we call a situation or conflict assessment as a way to tee up a process, right? And so hopefully what's clear here is we're trying to make sure the steps are in place, the ingredients are in place to move forward, and we're trying to understand, who needs to be involved and so on and so forth. So after that, we want to, of course, clarify responsibilities. What are the roles and responsibilities of the convener, with the convener being the agency typically that has ultimate decision-making authority, that's going to invite the others to the table. What are their roles and responsibilities? What are the roles and responsibilities of the facilitator? What are the roles and responsibilities of the representatives of different groups? Is there going to be space for expert advisors, right? And what are their roles going to be? What are the rules going to be for the involvement, including of observers? And so we talk about ground rules and agenda setting, but also when are others going to be involved? Are they going to be invited to observe, comment? What's their role going to be in this? And that is a kind of important last step there. It relates to this, right? Is how are we going to assess the ways in which we can communicate with the what we often call second tables, or the constituents that are being represented at the table, and the wider community at large, right? And so if you are there on behalf of the environmental community, for example, what is your responsibility and what practices are you going to undertake to ensure that you are getting buy-in from from the other environmentalists in the community, right? How do you make sure that they're on board with what you're doing? And that could be sometimes very challenging. And so that second table relationships, as well as relationships and reporting and information sharing with the wider community, can be so important. Okay, so once we've kind of done all that setting of the table through the convening and clarifying responsibilities, we need to get into the meat of it, right? We now have a group of folks. We're bringing them together for a series of meetings, typically, as I said before, that could unfold over a series of weeks or months. And there are some principles we probably want to try to adhere to, or at least encourage. One is certainly some degree, at least, of transparency. As we talked about last week, nobody should expect you to share everything about your interests, your bottom line, and so on and so forth. But at the very least, the more we can understand about each other's interests, the more we can engage in that creative process. So the more we can try to be a little transparent about what it is we ultimately care about, the more value that can be sought out. We often might want to seek expert input. We're going to come back to joint fact-finding. It's something I certainly work a lot on. But how can knowledge, data, expertise help us to arrive at better outcomes, inform our decision-making? How can we maximize joint gains through collaborative problem solving? So again, creative ways that we can provide outcomes everybody can live with. How do professional neutrals support that? How do we separate inventing from committing? That should sound very familiar from last week, right? How can we create spaces where people can explore things together without being called on it later and said, "Oh, well, you said maybe we could do that. You said that. Let's do it." So that's important separation. But at the same time, moving along in a way where we are on the same page. And so in other words, I'm not sitting at the table with my quote unquote text of what I think we're agreeing on, and you're sitting at the table with your sort of text that's kind of, overly optimistic about what you think we're going to end up with. Instead, we have a shared, what's often called single text procedure, where we're going along with a shared understanding, shared documentation as we evolve. And of course, after we've done all that really good, thick deliberation, we need to decide, right? And so ideally, we're looking for unanimity, right? We're looking for a package or a set of proposals that are going to maximize those joint gains. We're going to, of course, want to have some contingency plans as appropriate. We're going to want to adhere to the agreed upon ways in which we said we'd make decisions, right? And so if we said at the beginning, well, that we're going to make decisions in certain ways, that it's only going to be acceptable if, well, as in the role play, 5 out of 6 parties agree or whatever it is, then we're going to adhere to those. And then we're going to keep a written record of our commitments, just so later on we have those and that they're documented well. And of course, last but not least is the follow-through. How are they implemented? And so we really want to send those agreements back to each of the constituency groups. The representatives take them back to their constituencies, whether it's the rest of the neighborhood if you're there speaking on behalf of a neighborhood association, whether it's other environmental groups if you're there speaking on behalf of the environmental community, whether it's other businesses if you're there, say, on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, and you're asking for them to endorse what the group has arrived at. We want to, of course, then present that widely endorsed proposal to the decision-making authority and expect or ask them to act upon it, right? To accept it and act upon it. Of course, things are never going to be perfect, right? We know there's going to be things are going to change, that some things are going to work and some are not. So we want to provide opportunities for ongoing monitoring and implementation, and equally importantly, ways in which we can adapt to changing circumstances. So that's, as I said, a kind of archetypal model of what the consensus building can look like, but I think a lot of consensus building processes more or less follow something that looks like this. There are some key considerations I want to make sure we go through here, right? Things that we have to keep in mind, or critical to keep in mind as we go through consensus building processes. One is certainly the role of stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? And as I said before, stakeholders, really what we typically mean are those who will be impacted by and or that have some influence over the situation at hand or the decision at hand. But equally importantly to understanding what stakeholders are is thinking about who can really represent stakeholder groups in consensus building processes. And that can be tricky, right? For some groups, it's more or less obvious, right? If we're talking about a business community within a certain area, region, or city, or what have you, and it's, there's a well-organized and well-respected Chamber of Commerce, for example, they can be a relatively straightforward, unproblematic representative. But for some groups, like the neighborhood, it can be a lot harder, right? Sometimes there might be a neighborhood association, but they're not necessarily, not everybody necessarily belongs to it, not everybody necessarily trusts it. In other cases, an organization like that may not even exist. And so thinking about how do we find representation for stakeholder groups, and how do we ensure that that representation is legitimate and maintains some degree of accountability to its constituencies, can be really, really both important and challenging in consensus building processes. Because this model is so much based on this notion of stakeholders, right? We're not just randomly selecting participants. It's not a self-selection. We have these people who are supposed to be stakeholder representatives on behalf of interest groups. Speaking of interest groups, of course, is the notion of interests. And again, consensus building approach is really premised on this notion that what the deliberations are really about are how we reconcile different parties' interests. And so, therefore, successful deliberations and negotiations hinge on having a sense of what your interests are as a party at the table, and critically importantly, anticipating the interests of others at the table. And this really, really, as I said before, goes back to the negotiation theory we talked about last week, right? How do we do a good job of focusing on interests rather than positions, of trying to uncover parties' interests? Because that is really how we invest in or advance more creative solutions. It doesn't matter how forcefully or compellingly you argue. We often think of, as I said last week with negotiations, we often think about it as the debating team. I just need to make the most, convincing argument and I will win. I will be no. Typically people agree to something that is in their interests, and they don't or should not agree on something that's not in their interests. So we need to move beyond those positions and thinking we can win by just arguing or making the case for our position most effectively to exploring those underlying interests. And so it's not about inflated demands, it's not about positions, it's not about statements. It's about how do we become aware of parties' interests? How do we start to appreciate what is below the waterline? The consensus building approach at its core really does take a problem-solving orientation. It's not meant to be antagonistic or at its core just about the transactional. It's supposed to be about a group of people that are genuinely invested in separating themselves from the problem and being difficult on each other substantively, but not personally, right? Striving to understand each other, others' perspectives, acknowledging emotions and their place in negotiation, but employing real active listening and other related techniques to increase understanding. And that can be hard, right? Discussions do become emotional. People do form relational impressions of one another and so on and so forth. But the goal or the encouragement is to try to invest that energy in problem solving as opposed to, say, conflict. And the reason that problem-solving orientation is important is because, as we talked about last week, negotiations are often not zero-sum. So when there are multiple issues, value can be created by trading across them. But that problem-solving approach, active listening, willingness to be flexible, getting at the interests, and all those other things we talked about are what allow that to happen. And yeah, there's a lot of overlap here with what we talked about with the mutual gains approach to negotiation last week. And that's not surprising. Consensus building is really a process of establishing, or as an approach or technique or tool or set of tools for fostering what we might think of as mutual gains negotiation among various parties that are engaged around trying to address a problem or push for various solutions or ways forward vis-a-vis a problem. It is important, as I said last week, to acknowledge that some issues are actually zero-sum. And so this is not true in all cases, nor can all cases be successfully resolved through this kind of mutual gains approach. fourth key consideration is how we package agreements. So because we're seeking to trade across issues, because as I talked about last week, we want to be exploring those differences rather than looking for similarities. So for example, finding ways in which we might give, the group might give me more of what I care about in exchange for giving you more of what you care about. Because we're trying to do that, we really need to think in terms of packages. I need to know that I'm going to get in one area in order to give in other areas. And so if we were to approach this kind of process with working issue by issue, we'd be doomed to fail, because I'm not going to give anything on issue 1 if we haven't even talked about issue 2 yet, where I might actually get some benefit. I hope by now this is clear what we mean by consensus, but really consensus is an alternative to that traditional, voting where our goal is to get to 50% plus 1, and that's the measure of success or how we define success, to instead be looking in our deliberative processes following consensus building approaches for near unanimity, right? So that we have as many people as possible supporting it. And as you play the exercise this week, of course, you'll see that sometimes that's not necessarily complete consensus or complete unanimity. There might be times when we allow one party we leave one party out, I'll put it that way. But then in general, we're trying to get everybody on board. And so the process becomes one of pursuing creative outcomes that can meet everybody's needs, or at least the very least that everybody can live with. Coalitional dynamics are often important here. And I mentioned coalitions earlier, and I think I gave you an example of a winning coalition, blocking coalition. But just to repeat that in a multi-party negotiation, we're typically going to see a need for parties to, well, if they're trying to get agreement among parties, to try to form a winning coalition. That is to say, to try to offer enough to other parties to entice them to join their quote-unquote winning coalition. On the other hand, there might be times when somebody who is not happy about the way a process is evolving or an agreement is evolving will try to form a blocking coalition to bring parties onto their side. And so because we have this coalitional dynamics, there are times when parties are likely to kind of want to talk to each other or caucus on the sidelines, and that's perfectly fine. In the real world, of course, that happens because these meetings, are iterative. They happen over time. You'll have a meeting today. You'll have the next meeting in 2 weeks or a month from now. So there's chances for the parties to speak to one another. Something I'd like you to certainly keep in mind as we go through all the tools approaches this semester or over the next few weeks here is how they account for the future, and in particular how they account for implementation. Because arguably, if you're going to all this work to develop a proposal, to develop a solution or whatever it is to the problem you're trying to deal with, then you want to make sure that it's going to be implemented. Yet, to be honest with you, a surprisingly large number of these kind of deliberative processes, they pride themselves on bringing stakeholders together, they pride themselves on a good conversation, and they fall short on actually seeing it followed through on implemented. And so thinking about how we can both create the conditions for implementation and create conditions for change as things, new things emerge, as new learning occurs, both are important. The last key consideration I would highlight is the role of professional neutrals. And so we've talked about this before, but a professional neutral or team of neutrals is almost always critical to real-world consensus building processes. In the simulation we ran this week, I realized that there wasn't really a full-on professional neutral. The person running the meeting is or was from one of the stakeholder groups. And in this case, it's the foundation, Ledbetter Foundation. And that's fine. Sometimes that can work. But often when we're talking about these kinds of consensus building processes, we're talking about something that extends out over, as I said before, weeks, months, sometimes even years. And it makes sense and is extremely helpful to the success of the group if there's somebody who can not only help with the facilitation, as we talked about before, but can help with the process design and management, not just at the table, but also away from the table. Can help parties to prepare, help parties to be organized, can keep the process on track. That's really important. That there are, as we talked about when we talked about mediation and facilitation, there are different approaches. 2 weeks ago, I guess we talked about that, to mediation facilitation, but that becomes really important in this kind of process. And so I hope that gave you a sufficient overview of both, well, first of all, we went through steps of consensus building and how it's often approached, and then some of the key considerations. And as I said, I hope those key considerations are useful not just on increasing our understanding of consensus building, but
as a series of markers in the sand that we probably want to reflect on as we go through various tools and approaches. So how do other tools and approaches we look at, how do they deal with provisions for the future, or how do they use professional facilitators, mediators, or not? And so keeping those things in mind, I think, will be useful as we go forward. Where I want to pivot now here is to a couple of examples. So one example, this is not a project I worked on. In fact, neither of these is one I worked on really extensively myself. The second one I did a little bit of post hoc analysis on, but this one is one that former colleagues of mine at CBI did work on. And it was around negotiated rulemaking for Fire Island National Seashore in New York. So Fire Island is, obviously it's an island off the coast of Long Island, I believe, in Long Island Sound, that is fairly limited traffic. There's a ferry that goes there, but there's a lot of tension around, well, just how much traffic should be permitted on the island. And especially insofar as travel on the island typically involves, I don't know if you can see behind the text here, a picture of a Jeep, but involves driving along the beaches. And that can be threatening to various endangered species and to the fragile dune ecosystems themselves. And so it's always a question around when do we allow what kinds of vehicles under what conditions. And so this was done as a way to bring together the various stakeholders. As it says, it started with an assessment of what is the situation. And the process included various stakeholder representatives. So representatives of year-round residents, of part-time residents, of organizations, of contractors, of garbage and fuel haulers, of the ferry companies, of utilities, and of course of environmental and visitor groups. And it involved a series of 2-day meetings, and in the end they arrived at a set of rules. And those rules were, apropos, the whole point of consensus building, were rules that everybody could live with, right? That all the parties could accept. They may not be what they wanted. They may not have given, for example, the part-time residents all of the vehicle access that they would have hoped for. Or they may not have given the environmentalists the complete restriction or almost complete restriction on vehicles they might have hoped for. Instead, they kind of presented a series of creative outcomes that gave people enough of what they wanted. And so just to give you a couple of examples, one is that they restricted vehicle access much more during certain nesting times of year. So acknowledging that for those endangered species, especially bird populations, there are certain times that are much more sensitive than others. So let's just greatly limit vehicle traffic during those times. Also, you know, for the distinguishing between, for example, essential services like hauling of fuel, waste, and so on, distinguishing that from, for example, recreational tourism traffic. And so it was through those kinds of ways in which they creatively came to outcomes that everybody could live with, that they were able to arrive at a set of rules that work. Second example I'd give you is near and dear to me. I lived for a few years in Somerville, Massachusetts, and this is an area called Assembly Square. And Assembly Square was, at the time of when it was finally being developed, was the largest sort of underdeveloped parcel of land inside what's called the 128 corridor. For those of you from the DC area, it'd be like the equivalent of the Beltway, right? So kind of inside more urban Metro Boston. And as the name implies, at one point it was actually a assembly plant. It was a Ford Motor Company assembly plant where the Ford Edsel, if those of you that are familiar with lemon cars of years past, was manufactured. And after Ford moved away, it basically took on a series of uses. At this point, I think in this picture, what we're looking at, I'm not 100% sure, but I think is one of the phases perhaps of when it was turned into a mall. But it kind of was an underutilized, as you can see from the picture, relatively underutilized area. Unfortunately, it kind of had a bad reputation. It was the car theft capital of the United States for a while. And so there was a lot of interest in how can we redevelop this. This is a time when Somerville was going through quite an economic boom, when Greater Boston is going through an economic boom. A lot of opportunity and a lot of, I guess, energy investment may be the better way to put it. So real questions around what should happen with the future of Assembly Square. And we had developers show up that were keenly interested in turning the Assembly Square site into a large, what we might call a big box complex. And so big boxes are like these giant IKEAs. And in fact, IKEA was supposed to be one of the residents, a Home Depot. Some of these large magnet stores, these superstores, was what the developer wanted to do with this. But there was community opposition. In fact, a group emerged that was very opposed to the development put on the table by the developers. But interestingly, we often think that groups opposed to development is because they don't want development, they're anti-development. In this case, in fact, you might say that they actually wanted the opposite. What they wanted was a different type of development. They were worried that putting in these large superstores, big box stores, was bad for Somerville for a couple of reasons. One is it was going to drive greater increases in traffic flow. They were worried about the air quality impacts in an area that already suffers from very poor air quality because of the proximity of the interstate and some major rail lines and so on. And so they were worried this is just going to exacerbate the air quality and other impacts of traffic. They also were worried that, look, this is a poor use of this gem, of this really great opportunity, of this large parcel, because essentially building these big box stores, the tax revenue is relatively low. They don't produce top quality jobs and so on and so forth. So they said instead, what they wanted to see was something like this image we've shown here. We would call this a mixed-use development. They wanted actually, as I say, more development in some ways, but they wanted more walkable, public transit friendly, as I say, mixed use between commercial space, residential space, and certainly some retail as well. But a much more more ambitious project on the site. And so this group emerged and was quite savvy, and they fought for, no joke, 20 years or more over what would happen on this site. So the developer would move forward with a permitting proposal because they needed certain variances. They would either get turned down through the political institutions like the city council, or in some cases there were lawsuits. It was clear nothing was happening, and that nothing happening was bad for everybody involved, by the way. Because as much as the group didn't want to see the kind of development that was being proposed, they did want to see something happen with this site. So it sitting empty was to nobody's benefit. Ultimately, some conditions changed, and there was an opportunity that emerged for the parties, and in this case, primarily the main two parties, which were this community organization and the developers, to get together and deliberate on what would a better alternative look like. How could they meet the interests of various parties? And some of this was, a lot of this is spatial, and so, it had to do with where things are located. So a simple example would be the original site plan had the IKEA back right along the river, and the community group said, well, that seems like a poor use. Why would you have that along the river when the river is such an amenity? Instead, could we activate the river by having more, housing and some small retail in that area, some restaurants, cafes, that type of thing, and maybe the IKEA moves up closer to the front of the site, closer to the road. So that was one example. They also said, well, the orange line, you can see at the top of this little map, that orange line with a T on it. I hope that's clear to you. T is the name of the metro system in the Boston area. And said, look, there's a T metro line that goes right through the edge of this site. Why would we not use it as an opportunity to make this transit-oriented? Can we get money? Can we access money from the federal government, for example, and state governments to invest in building a T-stop here? And they really invested a lot. It was a lot of work, right? Working with designers, working with, we're going to talk about joint fact-finding in the future, working with joint fact-finding processes around understanding the air quality implications of different proposals. But the point is that they built this collaborative process to think about how they could develop the site in a way that everybody was happy with. And in the end, what do you know? The bottom right-hand picture and top left-hand picture are both from the site. It happened. The IKEA was never built, but that was more, I think, a strategic choice on the part of IKEA, is that they didn't need to build this second location in the Boston area in the end. Other than that, things moved ahead. It became a really vibrant mixed-use site. You can see the dog show happening there. It has some larger retail. It has a multiplex, as you can see in the background, but it also has a good mix of condos and apartments, a mix of smaller retail, some restaurants, and importantly, in terms of the tax base, one of the largest healthcare providers, maybe the largest healthcare provider in the Boston area, called Partners in Health, built their new headquarters in the site as well. And so you saw a mix of different types of jobs, from retail through to higher paying jobs in the healthcare industry. You saw a mix of residential. You saw, as I said before, the bottom right-hand picture shows you the new metro station built. So a lot of things happened, and these were things that clearly benefited the developer. They ended up making probably way more money than they would have off of a kind of slapdash kind of big box retail cluster. Certainly the community was happier, it increased tax revenue, and it ended up being a fairly vibrant place that I've been happy when I get to go back to the Boston area to see mature and succeed. So let's just do a really quick recap on what the consensus building approach is. So it's a model that encourages us to engage all stakeholders, or more precisely the representatives of all stakeholders, in a deliberative process that is focused on understanding the interests of parties, not just their positions, but their interests, so that as a participant in a process, you can ensure that you're meeting your own, but that you also have a good understanding of others, so that we can work to address or meet their interests, so that we can reach consensus on this. It's a process that, in the pursuit of understanding interests and translating those into outcomes, is of course problem-oriented, right? It involves the application of techniques like active listening. It really involves finding ways that we can trade across issues and differences to create value. And that takes, of course, as I said before, a commitment to packaging, thinking in terms of comprehensive packages where I get and I give in various areas. It certainly involves an element of creativity and problem solving. And it is by its name, consensus building, is focused on reaching consensus, reaching unanimity or near unanimity, rather than this emphasis on just getting enough people on board that we can ram the decision through. We know that coalitional dynamics can play an important factor in consensus building in multi-party negotiations, because once we have more than two parties, there's likely to be some ways in which parties can ally with each other and so on and so forth. We know that as agreements reach an end, we want to be, or as we start to formulate our agreements, formulate our outcomes, we need to be thinking about the future, right? So we need to have plans for contingency, what happens if things change, flexibility, for adaptive management, in light of this understanding that the future is dynamic, it's uncertain, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, consensus building processes typically involve some degree of the use of professional neutrals that can be more or less active, but that often will assist parties at and away from the table. And so we think back to our mediation week, very much in that line, that use mediators to help the parties prepare for and engage with one another, and that help lead to the best possible processes and outcomes. And so that's the consensus building approach. I hope that it's given you a good sense of it. As I said, not just because I think it's a great approach and we want to have it it's useful for us to at least be aware of in our toolkits and your toolkits, but also use it as a comparison as we go forward with other tools approaches.